Welcome back to Russian Khton. Today's story is about a mother's fierce pride, a son's hidden collapse, and the raw, quiet sacrifice born deep in the Russian provinces. Let's begin.
Anna Mikhailovna was a woman who had carved her life out of solid granite, wielding nothing but sheer willpower and a profound, terrifying fear of poverty. If you wanted to understand Anna, you had to understand the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, taking everyone's savings, pride, and pensions with it. Anna was a young single mother. While others wept or drank themselves to death, Anna became a Chelnok, a shuttle trader. She would ride freezing, unheated trains across borders to Turkey and Poland, hauling massive red and blue checkered plastic bags stuffed with cheap denim and synthetic sweaters. She had fought off racketeers, bribed customs officers, and stood in the biting Moscow frost at open-air markets, her feet wrapped in newspaper inside her boots to prevent frostbite. She had survived, but more importantly, she had ensured that her only son, Igor, would never know the smell of cheap, boiled cabbage, damp concrete, and desperation that had haunted her youth. And Igor was her masterpiece. At 32, he was the picture of modern Moscow success. He was the founder of a tech startup, drove a sleek, leased navy blue Audi, and wore Italian suits that looked like they had been painted onto his broad, athletic shoulders. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne and spoke casually of angel investors and burn rates. Anna looked at him and saw the ultimate justification for every tear she had ever shed, every humiliation she had ever swallowed. Her son was a prince, but every prince in Anna's hyper-vigilant mind was constantly under threat from scavengers. Moscow was a dark forest, and the wolves wore designer knockoffs and polite smiles. When Igor announced he was getting married, Anna had expected the daughter of a bank director, or perhaps a polished PR executive who spoke 3 languages. Instead, he brought home Marina. Marina was a vospitatel, a kindergarten teacher at a modest, state-run facility on the outskirts of the city. She was a quiet, pale girl from a small provincial town in the Ryazan region. She possessed a timid, apologetic smile, kept her natural, mousy brown hair tied in a simple braid, and wore clothes that made Anna's meticulously Botoxed eye twitch. Particularly, Marina had this one gray, chunky, misshapen cardigan. It looked exactly like it had been knitted by a blind provincial grandmother from the cheapest, scratchiest wool available at the local village market. Marina wore it constantly when the weather turned cold, wrapping herself in it like a security blanket. To Anna, the math of this relationship was painfully, offensively simple. A vospitatel made 30,000 rubles a month, barely enough to buy a decent pair of winter boots in the capital. Igor made millions. Marina was a classic provincialka, a provincial girl who had come to Moscow to catch a golden fish. She had managed to hook Anna's son, transitioning smoothly his Gryazi v. Knyazi from the dirt straight into royalty. "She's just waiting to drain you," Anna would tell Igor, pouring him a cup of dark, expensive Assam tea in her impeccably renovated cream-colored apartment. "She'll live like a cat in butter, entirely at your expense. Mark my words, Igor. Women like her, with their quiet voices and their tragic little sweaters, they are the most dangerous. They play the victim until your bank accounts are empty. Mom, please, you don't know her. She's pure. She doesn't care about the money," Igor would reply, looking away, rubbing the back of his neck in a nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. Anna would just sigh, a sound dripping with maternal martyrdom. She tolerated Marina, but she made sure the girl knew her place. Whenever the couple visited, Anna would launch into surgical, passive-aggressive strikes. "Marina? Malaya, my dear?" Anna would say, her voice dripping with artificial honey as she examined the girl's simple cotton blouse. "Did you buy this at a local flea market? You know, Igor has a status to maintain. A man in his position is judged by his wife. You cannot be seen wearing cheap synthetics next to him at corporate dinners. Let me give you the card of my personal seamstress. Igor will pay the bill, of course, as he always does." Marina would flush a deep crimson, looking down at her hands, pulling the sleeves of that hideous gray cardigan over her knuckles, and murmur a quiet, "Thank you, Anna Mikhailovna. I'll keep that in mind. She never fought back. She never raised her voice. She never complained. To Anna, this submissiveness was just further proof of Marina's guilt. The girl was a parasite, enduring the humiliation simply because the payout was worth it. The boiling point arrived in early autumn, just 3 weeks before Anna's 60th birthday. Anna had a spare key to Igor's luxury apartment in a gated, high-security complex in the prestigious western district of Moscow. She went there one Tuesday afternoon to drop off some homemade pelmeni, traditional Russian meat dumplings. She had spent 4 hours pinching the dough by hand, refusing to trust Marina to feed her son anything but cheap, store-bought pasta. It was an act of love, but also an act of territorial control. The apartment was empty, silent, and impeccably clean. As Anna opened the massive double-door refrigerator to put the pelmeni in the freezer, she noticed a stack of papers left carelessly on the kitchen island. She knew she shouldn't look. She was an educated, civilized woman, but a mother's protective paranoia, forged in the lawless 1990s, was infinitely stronger than her manners. She walked over and flipped the top page. It was a printout from a bank. Anna's eyes darted across the rows of numbers, her perfectly manicured fingernails tracing the columns. Her breath caught in her throat. She saw a massive sum, 3 million rubles. She saw a geographical marker, Ryazan Regional Branch. Anna did not read the fine print. She did not look at the columns marked debit or credit, nor did she read the words incoming transfer. In psychology, they call it tunnel vision. In Russia, they call it seeing what you already know to be true. Anna saw Igor's bank statement. She saw 3 million rubles, and she saw the name of the miserable provincial town where Marina's entire family lived. I knew it, Anna whispered, the crisp white paper trembling in her hands. The financial abyss she had always feared had finally opened up. Marina wasn't just living off Igor. She was actively, quietly funneling his wealth back to her village clan. She was bleeding the prince dry to build a mansion in the mud. She was probably buying apartments for her cousins and tractors for her uncles, all on Igor's dime. Anna didn't call Igor. She didn't confront Marina. She was a woman of the old Soviet school. She knew that a true execution required an audience, and a scandal of this magnitude required a proper stage. She decided to wait for her jubilee, her 60th anniversary jubilee. A 60th birthday in Russia is not just a party. It is a monumental milestone, a summing up of a person's life achievements. Anna had rented a lavish banquet hall in a restaurant decorated with heavy burgundy velvet curtains, gilded mirrors, and massive crystal chandeliers. There were 50 guests, former business partners from the 90s, influential friends, and distant, envious relatives. The tables groaned under the weight of traditional opulence. Crystal bowls filled with glistening red caviar, silver platters of smoked sturgeon, selyadka pod shoeboy, herring under a fur coat salad, and endless, sweating bottles of premium vodka and French wine. Anna sat at the head of the table, radiating triumph in an emerald green silk dress. Igor sat to her right, looking unusually pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He kept shifting uncomfortably in his tailored suit. Marina sat next to him, wearing a simple, understated navy blue dress that Anna had already mentally categorized as aggressively boring. 2 hours into the banquet, after the requisite long-winded toasts to Anna's health, iron will, and resilience, the room grew warm and pleasantly buzzed. The clinking of forks against porcelain began to slow down. Anna stood up. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a heavy silver knife. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the chatter. Absolute silence fell over the hall. "Dear friends," Anna began, her voice projecting effortlessly, commanding the room. "Today, looking at all of you, I feel the weight and the pride of my 60 years. I survived the 90s. I hauled those terrible checkered bags so we wouldn't starve. I raised a son alone, and I built a life from nothing. My greatest pride, my ultimate achievement, is sitting right here." She gestured dramatically to Igor, a successful man, a brilliant mind, a man who has conquered Moscow. Igor looked down at his empty plate. He looked like he wanted the polished parquet floor to open up and swallow him whole. "But success," Anna continued, her voice losing its warmth, taking on a sharp, metallic edge that made the guests sit up straighter. Attracts parasites. It attracts people who come to our city with nothing but a sweet, timid smile and empty pockets, looking for a free ride. The silence in the room thickened, suddenly suffocating. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging alarmed glances. Everyone in the room knew exactly who Anna was looking at. Marina froze. Her hand hovered motionless over her glass of sparkling water. "I always taught you, Igor, to be generous," Anna said, stepping away from her ornate chair, walking slowly behind her son and daughter-in-law, like a prosecutor in a courtroom. "But I never taught you to be a fool. I never taught you to let a girl siphon your hard-earned money to her provincial relatives." "Mom, stop," Igor choked out, his voice cracking, his face turning a blotchy red. "Please, sit down. Not here." "No, let them see. Let everyone see the truth." Anna's voice rose, vibrating with righteous, terrible fury. She reached into her emerald designer clutch and pulled out the folded bank statements she had taken from the kitchen. With a theatrical flourish, she threw them onto the white tablecloth right in front of Marina's plate. 3,000,000 rubles, Anna shouted, her finger pointing at the paper like a weapon. "Transferred to Ryazan. What is it, Marina? Are you building a 3-story dacha for your parents? Buying out the local collective farm?" "You are sucking my son dry." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. This wasn't just an insult. It was a public decimation. In Russian culture, you do not wash dirty linen in public. To do so at a jubilee meant the offense was beyond forgiveness. It was an execution. Marina stared down at the papers. She didn't cry. Her pale face turned the color of chalk, absolute white, but her eyes remained remarkably steady. She didn't look at Anna. She turned her head slowly and looked at Igor. Igor was trembling violently. His hands were gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles were bone white. He looked at the shocked faces of the 50 guests, at his mother's furious, triumphant face, and then at his wife's quiet, devastatingly calm expression. Something inside the immaculate, successful Moscow prince finally shattered. "You didn't read the paper properly, Mom," Igor said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but in the dead, electrified silence of the banquet hall, it sounded like a gunshot. Anna frowned, her triumphant smile faltering. Her hand froze in the air. "What?" Igor pushed his chair back and stood up. His tall, broad frame suddenly seemed to collapse inward, his perfect posture disintegrating, making him look like a frightened, exhausted teenager. He unbuttoned his expensive suit jacket, as if the fabric was suddenly suffocating him. "You only looked at the numbers, Mom," Igor repeated, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "You didn't read the transaction type. Those 3,000,000 rubles didn't go to Ryazan. They came from Ryazan, into my account." Anna stared at him, utterly bewildered, her mind struggling to process the Russian words. "Igor, what are you talking about? Your startup? Your investments? Why would money come from there?" "The startup went bankrupt 14 months ago," Igor said, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, jagged, ugly rush. He couldn't bear to look his mother in the eye. He looked at the crystal chandelier above them. "The main investors pulled out. I was left with massive debts. I panicked, Mom. I thought I could win it back. I took out shady microloans. I put the company's remaining funds into crypto, into margin trading, and I lost it all. Every single kopeck." A woman at the far end of the table let out a small, stifled cry. The silence that followed was so absolute, you could hear the hum of the restaurant's air conditioning. "I was facing criminal charges for embezzlement," Igor continued, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes, cutting wet tracks down his pale cheeks. "The people I owed money to, they weren't banks, Mom. They weren't the kind of people who send polite warning letters. They promised to break my legs. They knew where I lived. They promised to come after you." Anna grabbed the back of her chair. The world was suddenly tilting. The heavy gold, the velvet, the smell of expensive perfume. It all felt nauseatingly fake, a thin layer of paint peeling off a rotting wall. No, Igor, that's impossible," Anna stammered, her voice losing its absolute authority. "You have the Audi? You have the luxury apartment." Igor let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. "The Audi? The Audi's been parked in a rusted garage in an industrial zone in Khimki for 3 months because the repo men are looking for it. The apartment is mortgaged to the ceiling, and the bank is foreclosing next week. We're being evicted. Igor finally turned to look at his mother, completely stripped of his facade. The Moscow tech bro was gone, leaving only a terrified boy. We have been living entirely on Marina's 30,000 rubles a month, Igor wept. Do you know what that means in Moscow? It means we eat cheap macaroni 5 days a week. When you brought those pelmeni to our apartment on Tuesday, I cried. I sat in the kitchen and cried, Mom, because that was the first actual meat we had eaten in a month. I didn't tell you because I couldn't bear to see the look on your face. You sacrificed your youth, your health in the 90s to make me a success, and I became a total, utter fraud. Anna's breathing became incredibly shallow. She felt as though she were falling down a very dark, very deep elevator shaft. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the bank statements on the table. Then, the money, she gasped, the 3 million from Ryazan. In Russia, real estate is sacred, Mom. You taught me that, Igor whispered. He dropped to his knees right there on the restaurant floor, ruining his Italian trousers, completely indifferent to the 50 staring guests. He buried his face in his hands. Marina's grandmother died in spring, Igor sobbed into the silence. She left Marina a Khrushchevka, a tiny, run-down, one-room apartment in a Soviet-era block in Ryazan. It was the only thing she owned in the world, her only safety net, her only place to retreat if Moscow broke her. Igor looked up, his face red and wet with tears. Marina sold it. She sold her grandmother's apartment, her only home. She transferred every single ruble to my creditors to keep me out of prison and keep my legs intact. She burned her own future to the ground to save my life while you sat there mocking her clothes. The air in the room stopped moving. Anna slowly turned her head to look at Marina. The young woman was shivering. The emotional shock, combined with the harsh blast of the restaurant's air conditioning, had raised goosebumps on her pale arms. Quietly, without making a sound, Marina reached down into her large, cheap tote bag by the chair. She pulled out a sweater and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was the gray, chunky, misshapen cardigan, the ugly one, the one made of cheap, scratchy wool. Anna stared at the garment. A memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. Once, months ago, she had asked Marina why she insisted on wearing that hideous rag. Marina had smiled softly and said, My babushka knitted it for me before her eyes went bad. It keeps me warm. Anna looked at the cardigan, and then at the girl wearing it. Suddenly, the absolute, crushing truth of the universe crystallized before Anna's eyes. This ugly, cheap cardigan, which Anna had despised, was woven from the exact same fabric as the girl's soul. It was pure, unadulterated, unconditional warmth. Marina hadn't been quietly enduring Anna's horrific insults because she was a gold digger holding out for a payout. She had been enduring them because she loved a broken, terrified man enough to sacrifice her entire existence for him. She had stood between Igor and the abyss. She had sold her grandmother's concrete walls, her only sanctuary, but kept the ugly sweater to remember her by. She had quietly held the crushing weight of Igor's failures on her fragile shoulders, eating cheap pasta, absorbing his mother's venom without a single word of complaint, just to protect Anna from the heartbreak of knowing her son was a failure. Anna felt her knees give way. She collapsed heavily into her ornate chair. The crystal glasses, the expensive French wine, the caviar, it all turned to ash in her mouth. For 30 years, ever since those freezing train rides to Turkey, Anna had built her life on the belief that status and wealth were the ultimate armor against the cruelty of the world. She thought she had raised a prince. Instead, she had raised a weak, frightened boy in a leased suit who played casino games with his life. And the quiet, pale girl from the provinces, the one with the cheap shoes, the timid smile, and the blind grandmother's ugly cardigan. She was the only true royalty in the room. Anna looked down at the bank statement scattered on the white tablecloth. The printed words, incoming transfer, seemed to scream at her now. The numbers blurred entirely through a sudden, blinding rush of tears. She slowly reached across the table, bypassing the silver forks and crystal goblets. Her hand was trembling violently. She reached out and laid her perfectly manicured hand gently over Marina's small, bare fingers, which were clutching the edge of the gray wool cardigan. Anna opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but she had no words. For the first time in her 60 years, Anna Mikhailovna, the woman carved from solid granite, had absolutely nothing to say. The silence stretched on, heavier than the burgundy velvet curtains, as the Moscow prince wept on the parquet floor, and the Vospitatel from Ryazan gently held his shattered world together.
In the end, granite and money crumble before the warmth of a true Russian heart. In the world of fake princes, the only real royalty wears a scratchy hand-knitted sweater. Thank you for watching. See you in next video.